Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to xEssentials today. I'm not sure what number it is, but we've had quite a few so far. Today's topic is going to be how to set up a Falcon controller, presented by Jonathan DePlanche. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to So John, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Sam. Welcome, everybody. Glad to be on here presenting again. Sorry I couldn't do this back towards the end of February, but back on here now because John Spiker couldn't be here tonight, so we switched things up a little bit and carrying on like we usually do. So, and thanks to Sam for taking over for Ed, and Ed, even though he's not here, for getting everything set up for this. So as it says, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to set up a Falcon controller. There's a lot of questions that seem to come up on that, so kind of go over it. Not going to go through everything, just for the interest of time. For those that have heard me speak before, I tend to be a little bit long-winded on things, so this probably will go a little over an hour, but I'm going to try to keep it less than 2. I don't want to break the record for the year for the length of the presentation. A little bit of what I'll be talking about is just a basic overview of the Falcon controller boards that are there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the maximum pixel counts because that tends to get a lot of people confused. So I want to try to clarify that. I'm going to talk a little bit about a basic network connection for setting up everything, and then your controller settings for both your pixels and serial ports and how you can do that through Xlights or manually from the controller. So a few things on here. I do want to mention this isn't a sales presentation. It's a how-to set up things. I'm not trying to tell you that you got to buy a Falcon controller and that's the only good one. It's what I use. It's what I know best. So I'm most familiar with that. That's why I'm presenting on it. I don't work for Falcon. You will see my name on the manuals because I did help David write the manuals and a few others working on that. But I don't get paid by Falcon. I don't get a commission for every board he sells. It would be nice if I did, but I don't. But I don't get anything like that. I'm just one of the guys that helps out with these things, helps out with Xlights where I can too. So just giving back to everybody that's contributed over the years. I also want to point out too that I am not a developer. I can do a little bit with like the XML files, uploading some of those, managing some of the stuff on the Google Drive. But when it actually gets into Xlights code or the Falcon code, I don't know how to read it. I don't know how to write it. I don't know how to fix it. I'm probably going to say something a little bit wrong about how it works internally. That's all behind the scenes stuff that really doesn't matter to most of us, but the developers will catch me on it and go, well, you're not quite right about that. So the big thing here is I can't fix a lot of these problems. I can just point you a way to work around them, or I can show you how to submit a bug report and do something like that. So if you see something that isn't right when you're trying to do something, hit me up anytime, either in the Zoom room or on Facebook or in one of the forums. If it's an error and a bug, we can get it worked out for you most of the time. There's a few things that just going over with Keith the other day, making this presentation, found a bug, submitted it to him. It'll probably be fixed in the next release. So Falcon controllers are controllers that are available on pixelcontroller.com. I'm not going to talk about FPP, which is also a Falcon Pi player. I'm not going to talk about that because that's more open source. That is software that runs on either a BeagleBone or a Pi. Even though it shares the Falcon name, I'm not going to get into that here. That's not what this presentation is about. That would be a complete different thing. What I'm going to talk about is the F4 V3, the F16 V3, and the F48 V3. Falcon also does make the Pi cap that would go onto a Pi. Not really going to talk about that one because that's more setting up your FPP just to use that. I'm also not going to talk too much about the distro boards for power. Those are pretty much straightforward, and that's just how to be able to use that. Then there's the F-amps. F-amps are just an amplifier to make your signal go a little bit farther. You just pretty much plug them in, forget about them, so there's not much to talk about there. You can get them on the pixelcontroller.com page, but there really isn't anything too much to say about those. I will point out a lot of people have a lot of questions. A lot of the slides on here are going to be taken directly from the manual. So if you found the pixelcontroller.com thing, you go to support, you choose the control or the products page, and then go to what particular controller you have. There's a user manual. That's what I helped write for these. They are a little bit out of date because, well, they got busy and haven't had a chance to update all of those. But a lot of the information that people are asked is in the manual there. The manuals aren't great for reading start to finish and understanding everything. But if you don't understand a specific thing, you can go in there, you can do a search, and you can find something on it relatively easy. Again, it's not a step-by-step. It's not a how-to for dummies. It's a little more on the technical side, but I tried to get as much information in there as if you're looking for something, you can find it. Another good resource too, if you don't want to look at the user manual, is the Canis Vader Christmas videos. He walks you through a lot of the same stuff. I think he stole some stuff from the manual, and then I stole some stuff from him. So we don't really work with each other, but we've taken stuff from each other to try to make it fairly informative for everybody. So going to go through a few features. Right here is an F16, but a lot of the controllers have the same general features on here. You're going to have a pair of Ethernet connectors. This is what connects to either your computer or your Pi to get the board its signals. There are two of them because you have an input and an output essentially. Either one can be used for either. You don't have to plug into any particular one. It doesn't matter which you plug into. This allows the controllers to be daisy chained, so you can put several of them onto one connection and don't have to run a Cat5 cable out to each one. You can just put several in a line. There is a limit of probably 2 or 3, depending on how many universes you're putting on there, that will effectively run a show. But for setup purposes, you can easily hook up a dozen of them and not have any problems. But when you get to running your show, there's only so much going in and out of there that it's going to be able to handle before you hit some lag. The OLED is just the little screen over here on the left side, and there's buttons that are below it for changing things. This gives you a lot of good status information. It'll show you your IP address, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. The buttons allow you to change a lot of those type functions or IP and that information. It's a good thing to be able to see, to find out what your controller address is, and to be able to change without having to get into the software and know what IP you need to get into the software. Pixel ports, these are what you plug your strings of lights into to make them blank. The F16 has 16. They're the little green things that you connect to and plug in to that. That's where the names come from on this. On the Falcon line of controllers, every one of them has their own little output fuse. They're 5-amp fuses, so they only put out so much power per thing. If you're going to run more pixels than 5 amps will take, then you need to power inject, and then you have to fuse from whatever that's coming off of, a distro board or your own homemade cables or fuses or something like that. There also is on all of these controllers a little expansion connector in the middle of the board that takes a ribbon cable. You plug into the main controller, then you plug that into the expansion board, which I'll show a few examples of a little bit later. Connect that together and you can get more ports on here. You won't get more channels by doing this on most of the controllers. You're just able to spread out your connectors farther, spread them out a little bit more, or have more to plug into, so that you might not need to power inject, or might have more ports so that you don't have to go from a mega tree into an arch into a star and do all of that. This helps you spread it out a little bit. LED status indicators, these are really important. The first one over here, there's 3 small ones there. The leftmost one tells you if you have power. The middle one tells you if you're running in data mode. The right-hand side tells you if you're running in test mode. If those lights don't light up, you typically don't have power on here. You may have power coming to these fuses and these light up, but if you don't have this light up here, for some reason, power's not getting to the brains of the board and not functioning. So a lot of times, if you look at those little LED indicators, they're a good sign if you're trying to troubleshoot things. Over on the right-hand side, there's more little Cat5 jacks. These are not your Ethernet connectors like over here. These are for connecting serial ports, maybe one expansion board to something along those lines. Never connect these up to your computer to talk to, or your FPP. They don't work with that. They're meant for connecting to other things. And I'll mention this again later, but never connect LOR into DMX1. Only connect LOR boards into DMX2 or 3. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. The other features on here, I'm not really going to get into because they're a little bit higher end, trying to keep this relatively short so we don't have to talk about it. I'm also not going to talk about the power connectors. Most people can pretty well figure out how to connect power to this correctly and get everything to move along fine. If there's any questions on that later, I'm happy to answer them. Look at the manual, look at Canis Vader Christmas videos. You can pretty much figure out how to do that. Don't get too many questions on that. One other thing up here, the micro SD card slot, that is somewhat important if you're trying to upgrade the firmware or if you're going to put this into standalone mode. That's where the card goes into for doing that type of upgrade. So the F4, I'll talk a little bit about each of the controllers I'm going through. The F4 is the one with the least amount of onboard ports. There's 4 pixel ports on board. Each of those can control 1,024 pixels per port. So the total board would be 4,096 total. It's got one serial port here. They can put out 1 DMX universe or power 1 pixel port on a differential receiver. Not all 4, just 1 on there. You can connect 1 2-port differential receiver on here, which will allow you to connect 2 differential receivers to the main board. And in this case, and on this controller only, this does not split the channels. You will get the full 1024 on each of those additional 4 ports on each of those 2 receivers. So this basically turns an F4 into an F12, each with those 12 ports with the 1024 pixels per port. And as you'll see, 1,000 or 12,288 total pixels could be controlled by this. That's unique for this one. The other boards I'm going to talk about split it a little bit differently. They share it. This particular board does not because it uses the same processor but has a lot less ports. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, Dave's discontinued. He doesn't sell that anymore. Too many headaches of people not knowing how to fly them and crashing them into the ground. So he doesn't sell that anymore. The F-16 V3, however, he still does sell. Again, the F-16 just represents 16 pixel ports on board, each of them with 1024 maximum pixels, and you can see the total count there. You've got the 16 here, the 8 on the right-hand side are powered on this side, the 8 on the left are powered on this side. Whatever the voltage you put in on here is what the voltage will be coming out of these sections. You can have different voltages on each side. They don't have to be the same. They can be the same. The board ties the ground together, so you don't need to worry about that too much. This has, instead of just 1 serial output port, it has the 3 that you can plug different things into. Not all that complicated to use, but it's got the 3 of them there, so you're allowed to do it. This also does have the expansion port, and on the F-16, you can plug up to 2 expansion boards into there. There's different type of expansion boards that I'll go into there, but if you plug in either 1 or 2, that 16,384 pixels that's total on the board gets split up between this main board and the 2 expansions. I'll talk about that a little bit later, how exactly that happens, but it's a split on the F-16. The F-48 is very similar to the F-16 in that it's the same number of serial ports, except it doesn't have an expansion. The expansions are more or less built in because you have 1 through 16 on this top row of jacks, 17 through 32 on the second row, and 33 through 48 down on the bottom. There are no onboard pixel ports for this. You need to use this with differential receivers. You can use as few as 1 differential receiver on here if you just wanted to power 1 port. But if you wanted to use more, you can plug it into all 12 of these connectors. Each of the differential receivers has 4 ports, so you get the 48 on there. If you use more than the first 16, the first 4 here for the differential, which each has 4 on it for the 16, then you'll end up needing to split your pixels. If you don't use that, then you can use the full thing on that. Like I said, this is not expandable because the full expansion is built right into there. I've mentioned a few times the differential receiver boards. They're also called smart receivers now. They've switched over to ones that give you some daisy chain ability on here, where you can connect up to 3 of these in a row. But when you have the F48 or certain expansions on the other boards, you plug a Cat5 cable into the board, into one of these jacks, either one, it doesn't matter. And you can run this somewhere in the field, farther away from the controller, or even leave it right next to it. You can go up to 250 feet from the controller to the farthest one of these, even if you're daisy chaining them. The farthest one can only be 250 feet away for a reliable signal. It can get its own power. The power does not need to match what's on the controller. Whatever power is coming in here is what's going to be the power coming out of the ports here. So you can have some with 5 volts, some with 12 volts, whatever you really need for this. Again, they're all fused. It's got indicator lights on it. It uses the same pinout as the F16, but it does not have the clock signal on here. Not many people use pixels that need the clock signal, but you can't use them on these differential receivers if you're trying to do that. There are switches on here for setting the terminator, which is this, it's the last board on a daisy chain, or even just one. You set the terminators to on, that's in the manual how to do it. But you set them on if it's the last, you set them to off if it's not the last. And the mode dip switch tells you if it's A, B, C, or the old, what a lot of people call dumb receiver mode on there. When you daisy chain these here, the first one coming off a port is going to be your A board, typically, and you're going to have ports 1, 2, 3, and 4 if it's connected to the one that says 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they're going to be 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A. When you go to the next one, it's 1B, 2B, 3B, 4B. I just deleted my 1 there. The final one is C. A lot of people get kind of confused on this, and they think that it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 on here, and then 5, 6, 7, 8. That's not the case. You always follow the numbers of the port that you're plugging into. You don't follow sequentially up through that. The A's, B's, and C's, everything on this board's A, everything on this board's B, everything on this board's C. Like I said before, the last one always has to be terminated. So in this case, if we're using 3, we would terminate the C board. If we're only using 2 of them, we terminate the B board. We're only using A and B. If you're only using 1, you can set this for A and terminate it, or you can set this just for the old dumb mode and terminate it as well. Generally speaking, if you're only using A boards, there's really no purpose to set it up for A. Just use it in the old traditional mode and go with that. But there is no harm in setting it for A and using it that way. Just make sure you set your mode switch accordingly on the controller for that. One of the features I'll show a little bit later that Keith just added in the .18 version of Xlights is you can set things up to use this different boards, and you might spill over onto an A and need to set it up that way. The differential expansion boards on the left-hand side, this is what would plug into an F4 and give you 2 expansion ports. You can see on the top here, it's labeled 5 through 8, 9 through 12. You can have up to 12 ports on an F48. The F16 differential expansion, you can plug up to 2 of these onto a F16, and it gives you 4 of the differential expansion ports on each, which gives you a total of 16 additional for each one of those that are on there. So these add receiver ports that you have to do. You need to get those separately, run those off of these. Again, no onboard ports on these. If you wanted onboard ports, you can only add that with the F16 expansion board. This gives you 16 additional ports that you add on to here. Again, it's got 2 places for the ribbon cables. You can add on up to 2 of these per board. You choose which one it is with the little jumper over here, either 17 through 32 or 33 through 46, connecting through the ribbon cable. This is great if you have a high density prop very close, but you don't want to deal with something like a lot of power injection, or let's say you have 2 megatrees, one on the right side, one on the left side, and you don't want to have to try running those all over. You can split it up. Again, with either type of expansion board that you have to use connected to an F16, you're going to be sharing the pixels with the main board. This is not giving you additional pixels. It's just splitting up where the differential goes. I do see a question in chat, and I'll jump back. It says something about a jumper for 5 volts or 12 volts on the main board. I'll go back to that just a few slides here. There is a jumper that over here that asks what your power source is. or input power up here. I'm sorry, it's not down there. That's telling you which source, this source or this source. That's saying your input power. That is to tell what the processor needs to do, whether it needs to step it down from the 12 volt to a 5 volt, or if it's 5 volt directly. You don't need to tell it what pixel power is coming in for your pixels. It doesn't matter what your pixels are using. This is for the brains of the controller. You want to set that properly so you don't fry the controller and so that it works properly, but you don't need to set that up for your pixels. Your pixels can be anything you want them to be. Okay, so let's get into the maximum pixel counts. It's going to be a little bit confusing on there because a lot of people want to put a lot of pixels on here, and this is a lot of the questions that we find in the Zoom room on here. If you do just the 16 on the F16 or the top row here on the F48, you can get the full 1024 pixels per port. That will require you to do power injection on here. You can't run 1,000 pixels without power injection. That's a function of power and the pixels, not the boards. There is no board that is going to power 1,000 pixels all by itself. Even if you set the brightness down to 10%, it's just not going to happen. So this just has the ability to send out that signal and the refresh rates to that many pixels without a problem. If you have an F4, all of the ports with or without expansion will have that 1024. Like I said, if it's the F16, these ports on the main controller can do that with no expansion, or just these ports here if you're using the F48. When expansions are added to the boards with the ribbon cables, or if you're getting into anything above 17 or higher on the F48, and you set up your controller, you're going to see these little sliders on there that tell you how many nodes you get for each bank. I'll talk in a minute about what the banks are, but you adjust these sliders to tell how many maximum pixels per port you can have on each of the up to 3 ports on it. If you don't have any expansions, you're not going to see this box because you're going to get the 1024. If you have 1 expansion, you're going to get 1 slider and 2 numbers. 2 expansion, you get both sliders and all 3 numbers. If you want to fine tune where this moves, you move it with your mouse or the arrow keys on your keyboard for a little bit less. The banks that I'm going to talk about on here, it's a little bit confusing for a lot of people. I'm going to call them banks 1, 2, and 3. I originally was going to call them banks A, B, and C, but those are the different or the smart receivers, which gets a little confusing, but I color code it to keep track. Bank 1 is what's on the main board on the F16 or the top row on the F48. Bank 2 is the next row on the F48, and whatever you're connecting to call number 17 through 32 on the F16 if you're using an expansion. It can be either the onboard pixels or the differential pixels that you plug into here. Either of these can be connected in either order to this, it doesn't matter. The final row down here or the second expansion board that's set up for 33 to 48 is your third bank. And I just used RGB for the colors on this because that's what people typically know and can remember fairly easy with what our hobby is. On here with these expansions, either of these can be used. So you can have the F16 with 2 of these type with onboard ports. You can have the F16 with 2 of these, or you can mix and match and make them in any order you want to. It's really up to you. It doesn't matter whatsoever. There are no limits. You just adjust your jumpers accordingly. So the first number on here is the maximum number of pixels per port on the first bank. Again, ports 1 through 16, 17 through 32 is the second one, 33 to 48 is the third one. It's relatively easy to understand what that is, how you adjust that. But remember, it's for all of the ports on that particular bank. You don't have individual control over one port versus another port. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes into. The sliders can be moved anywhere you need it to be. The minimum number on like the F48 is going to go down to 1. So theoretically, you can't get 1024 on there. You can get 1022 if you're only using the first row. But these numbers here will always total up to 1024. You can't change that. That's the limit on the controller. And as I said before, with only 1 expansion, you're going to drop out one of these. The number will increase on the other one. It will still equal 1024, but it's over 2 banks instead of 3. So a common misconception that I hear all the time is that when you're setting up your board, you want to add up port 1, port 17, and port 33 to make sure that that's under the 1024. Then you want to add port 2, port 18, port 34, make sure that's under 24. And you go down the list and check all of those. That is not quite right. It might be how the controller sends out the data internally, but that's not how you're going to be able to adjust things and set it up. So it's not really all that helpful. Sometimes it works out and it is the way it goes and it makes sense to people, but there are other situations that can get you in trouble thinking, well, I have it set up, I add these all together, it works just fine, I go to do it and it's giving me errors. So I'm going to go into a little bit more on that. Let's just use a hypothetical situation where we have F48 and we're fully using every port on there, but we're only putting 100 pixels on each. We want to run them at full brightness. We don't want to worry about any power injection. So we're going to put 100 on everything. We could do this up to 340 pixels on it, and this will work, no problems. You add 340 times 3, you're still going to be under the 1024. Here, I'm just using 100. Every one of these, when you total up, what would be used, the 1, 17, and 33, shows 300 pixels. This shows it works, it will work, but it doesn't tell you the whole story of what's going on. It is very similar to what you'd see in your visualizer through Xlights, for those that are familiar with it. If not, I'll explain a little bit this more. But every one of these ports has 100 pixels on it, 1 through 16. If we go over here and we go through ports 1 through 16, I've just indicated it on red as that. We've got 100 on each of them. We've got no problems there. We add on 100 for the next 2 ports, and we're adding 100 for the 17 through 32, 33 to 48. We put it in there. We total that up. We're on 300 pixels. The limit that we have over here is 1024. We're well below that. We've got no problem here. No matter which way we look at that, no problem whatsoever. We can adjust our expansions. We've got 100 on everything, 100 on the first one, 100 on the second one. Like I said, these have to total up to 1024. So this one's going to be over 100, but that's okay because we're only putting 100 on there. So we're well below. So let's change this up a little bit. And on 1, 17, and 33, I'm going to increase that up to 400 pixels. I do that. We add up the 3. It shows 1200. We know that this isn't going to work. I just put the red X here to symbolize that. If one of these doesn't add up correctly, one fails, they all fail. This isn't going to work. It isn't going to upload. You couldn't configure your controller to do that. It's not going to do it. But it doesn't tell you the whole story. These ones passing here doesn't mean it's going to work. The whole thing will fail. We know that, but it's not telling the complete story again. And again, just visualizing it a little bit differently, this 1, 17, and 33, when we add them together, well over the 1024 number here. So this isn't going to work. It's going to fail. I've kind of shown it just in a different way to go here. So let's mix this up a little bit and see if we can get this to work. Instead of putting the 400 pixels on 1, 17, and 33, I'm going to take the 400 off of 17, move it to 18. I'm going to take the 400 off of 33, move it to 35. If I were to go with the way that a lot of people say, you add up these first 3 rows, I add up, I get 600 each. Anything below that, I didn't include them all here, but they would all be at 300 each. It looks like this is going to work because none of these numbers are over 1024. So a lot of people will go, well, this is going to work. There's going to be no problem with it. But that's not how the controller works. It's not going to be able to function. You can't set it up this way because your slider here is for everything on ports 1 through 16. We're telling it needs 400 for the first one, but down here on these, it's only got 100. And then it's packing the rest of these in right next to it. Realistically, it can't do this. It can't adjust a slider that's coming down, jumping over, for this next one coming down to jumping over. The slider is a full line that would be going on here that would need to go around it. And what it's actually going to end up looking like is something a little different. Again, this isn't how it's going to work. What works is you take everything that would be in red and you figure out the maximum number of pixels on any one of these ports 1 through 16. So if you look through here, the maximum number is 400. You look through here, again, I've set it up for 400. Go over to this one, maximum is 400. We total those up, 1200, it's over the 1024, so it's not going to work. Whenever you do it, you find the maximum on each one of these banks that we would have that I discussed before, sum the maxes, and that's the only number that matters. Any of these summing up of rows here doesn't matter whatsoever for setting up your controller. These numbers can be anything whatsoever. It's not going to matter. If they're over 1024, yes, it's not going to work. But under does not guarantee it's going to work, as the case here. All under 1024, this number is 1200, not going to work. And that's because, like I said, these sliders adjust the entire thing. So if I've got 400 on port 1, it's coming out to here. The next thing here, I don't have 400 on 17, but I got it on 18. That slider that sets this 400 is going to come all the way over here. And I'm up to 800 already just for these two banks. If I want to hit another 400 over here, it pushes me over this 1024 limit. It's not going to work. So you always have to look at the maximums on any of these banks of pixels. Don't just sum 1, 17, and 33 working down the line. That's not how it works. You got to come down and you got to sum everything. Going back to that first case where we had 100 on everything, where I told you it didn't tell the full story, the maximum on everything was 100. So you'll see it still adds up to 300, which was the same here. It still works. And that's why a lot of people will be of this mindset. If I keep the sum of all of these under the 1024, it's going to work. It can, and it does in a lot of cases, but it's not guaranteed to work in all cases. Always do your maximums, sum your maximum. That'll tell you if it's going to work or not. So why do we sum the maximums? Well, the smart ass way to do it is because that's the way David designed it. He set it up. He wrote the hardware and firmware. That's how he wanted to do it. That's the controller you bought. That's what you're stuck with. There are some hardware limitations and firmware limitations that he has to keep the processor to certain things. And I'm not going to get into too much on that. That's his choice on how he wants to do things. And other controllers do things a little bit differently. They don't have that shared type thing, but they don't have that. Others don't even have that ability to expand. So everybody's got their own little things. But the main thing that it comes down to of why we sum the maximums rather than summing individuals, there's only one slider that we can do. The sliders control the banks of pixels. They don't control individual ports. So when you look at that, you just need to remember that this is for banks. It's not for individual ports. It's for banks of ports. So I'm going to show a little bit more on this just to kind of show a few different scenarios. And you'll hear a lot of people talking about trying to pack things in. And when we're trying to pack in our pixels or trying to get a high amount of pixels together, that's because if you put 400 on your first bank, on your first port here, that's your maximum. That sets the limit way up here. For all of these ones over here where I have either nothing here or 100 here, I've got a bunch of basically wasted space and capability of the controller. There's a lot more pixels I could put on these ports, and I would not affect my total count whatsoever because my maximum isn't changing. So rather than taking some of these ones that are like 200 over in this area, if I were to put them in here, I could actually move this controller down a little bit. Now that works great if all of these things are relatively close together and I can do that. That's not always going to be the case. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to put 400 on one here, 400 here, 400 here, have them on different ports going all over the place and push this up where everything else is way down in the 100 range. You want to try to get all of your 16 highest channel counts as close together on the same bank as you can. And it doesn't matter. This first bank, if these all are 100s and the second bank is all 200 or higher and this third bank has 400s, that's fine. You can flip-flop where these go and you still get the same result. You're summing the maximum for all of them. It's not the order of which they do, it's the maximums. So when you hear people talk about trying to pack things in, it's for your own benefit for doing that, keeping your channel count as far away from you can as the 1024 limit by basically keeping the groups together and in that. Another thing that you can do with some of that, you can see here, I've got 400 as my maximum up here, 300 here, 350 here. if I have this on a F48 where I'm using all of these for props that are all over my yard, I'm over at the 1024 and it looks like, oh, well, this controller is not going to work for me. But my F48 that uses the differential receivers, they're groups of 4. If I look at this group of 4 here, my maximum on that particular one is 150. My maximum over here is 350. If I flip-flop these 2 locations, it works fine. Instead of being up at 1024, I'm down about 850 pixels. I just made that simple little switch with differential receivers and it's all good to go. I dropped over 200 about 200 pixels off of there just by reconfiguring which ports it go to. I didn't make any changes to anything physically for wiring everything up or doing that. And it's a simple little fix with the controller. For originally, I had low counts on 13 through 16, very high counts coming into 41 through 44. I don't even need to touch anything with the ports over here. All I need to do is flip-flop where these plug in to the controller board, switch the cables at the controller, update the ports in Xlights, and it will work just fine. So when you're going through things like this and you see very high counts, very low counts, something like this, you might not make a chart like this, but keep in mind what it's going to be doing. It will really help you out in the long run to try to get things where they need to be and get the most out of your controller. Any of these little shaded blank spaces I have on these, it's wasted space that you're not using for anything that you could be taking advantage of. When you get over here, a lot less wasted space, a lot less wasted capability of the controller. The more you can fit in there, the better off you'll be. Now, some people don't want to take advantage of that with dealing with power injection or anything like that. That's fine and good. You don't have to do it. I'm just trying to show you a way to optimize your controller if you do choose to do that. Smart receivers, when you're putting them into the daisy chain mode and you have your A board, your B board, and your C board, the A, B, and C get added together for the total count on that particular port. So it's not the maximum on each board for these because they share an A, B, and C. It's you add up the A, B, and C together. So if I have 100 on the A board for each of these pixels and 50 on each port on the B, 50 on each of the C, each one of these has 200 on it. 200 is the number that I'm going to compare to everything on 5 through 16, see which is the maximum, and add that together. So it's a little bit confusing when you do that because you're adding 1A, 1B, 1C together, figuring out what the maximum is for one. A little bit different than we were just talking about in the other case. And then that 1A, 1B, 1C, you'll determine the maximum of that through 1 through 16, add that through the maximum of the other twos and move forward with that. Now, something you might look at, and a lot of us will do things like this, is because we're kind of creatures of habit. Let's say I have something here. I've got a little mega tree or mini tree, I will call it, that's got, we're going to say 300 pixels on it. I've got a candy cane on each side that we're going to say each one of those is 100 pixels, probably realistically 99, but 100 was a nice round number. And we got a star on top that's got 50 pixels on that. If I were to set up one of these in the yard, and I just said, I'm going to put this on port 1, one of these on 2, one of these on 3, this on 4, oh, well and good. But let's say I actually want to put 3 of these in my yard. Well, what I'll probably do is I'll copy this over, paste it over in Xlights, make 3 of them, chain it together, and I use the same pixels. I'm going to always have this. This will be on my A, this will be on my B, this will be on my C. So I'm going to use this on 1, this on 1A, this 1B, this 1C. If I do that and add up together, because these trees are all on that one port, you had the 300, 300, 300, I've got 900 pixels on port 1. I've got much lower on 2, 3, and even less on 4, because 4 is my star. This eats up a lot of my pixels. I've only got 1024 that I can play with on my other 2 banks. If this is an F48 that's doing it, leaves less than 100 pixels for each of those 2 ports. Not something you really want to do. You're eating it up all in the first few. You want to try to spread that out as much as possible. But there's no reason that this has to be on 1. The tree has to be on 1 on all of them. If you were to switch it around a little bit, and instead of putting the tree on 1 and one of the candy canes on 2, you flip-flop that. Put the tree on 2, the candy cane on 1, on your B board. On your C board, you flip-flop it so that your tree is on 3 and your candy cane is on 1. You're still working off the same port. You're not, or same differential board. You're just changing the ports on there that you're using. When you sum these together, I've dropped from 900 down to 500 just by changing what port I've hooked it up to. And you'll see too, instead of having 900 and then 300s, where this is much larger than these, I've got these pretty well spread out. I've got 3 of them at 500. I still have 150. I could adjust this, but I'm never going to get below the 500, so that doesn't matter. But I just saved 400 pixels for use on other controllers, other differential receivers, whatever you want to call them, that can be set up. So sometimes you need to look at things and go, does it make sense the way that I'm setting it up? How can I even things out the best? You want to spread them out. You want to get it all set there. I have made a what I call Falcon Pixel port cheat sheet that is in the official Xlights support group. If you type in these names, look at the October 15th date. I have it both in PDF and Excel format. It kind of totals up these numbers for you if you want to do it either by hand, or if you're good with Excel, by that. It helps you get an idea for what you need to do for totaling things up. There's several tabs or several pages in there that you can use for it. This is a F48 with smart receivers. I have it F48 with just the traditional receivers where you don't have the A, B, and C. I have it in F16 with different types of receivers. You just basically go in there. If you're using the Excel, it'll do all the calculations for you. If you're doing it by hand, it's pretty straightforward to follow. You put in the number of the pixels in any of these orangish boxes. It tells you, you add them together here, you total it up here. You take the maximum on these 4, you write it in the box here. You take the maximum of these 4, you write it in the box here. Then you add these together and you figure out what this number is. If your number is over 1024, then it's not going to work. If it's under 1024, it's going to work. I think the cheat sheet is fairly straightforward to use. I hope it's helpful to people. Again, if you're not good with Excel, just get the PDF, print out the sheet you need. I think it can help you out visualize a lot of this. What else it will do is it will show you when you're looking at it, if you have differential receivers here and you see that you have something like 900 up here and 50, or let's say 100, 100, and 100, and then another 900 over here. Well, if you were just to flip-flop the 2 of these, then maybe you can make things work a lot nicer for you. I do plan on making a few modifications to that spreadsheet in the near future. I haven't got to it yet. It'll work just fine for you. The enhancements are basically just to kind of help you visualize with those little graphs that I was showing earlier, so you can faster and easier see, okay, where should I even things out? How can I make it a little bit better? If you are using an F48 with all smart receivers, what I would recommend is, because it really doesn't matter where you put things, your highest total pixel ports, you're going to have 12 receivers. The first 4 that you have here on the first bank should be the ones with your highest pixel counts. These should be your next, these should be your next. Basically, the first board should be your highest one to evenly spread things out. I'm going to try to put that in there too in a way that people will be able to understand. A lot of times here, I have been talking about a 1024 maximum. That is what the controller limit is. It can't go above 1024. When you go to the full 1024, it'll run at 20 frames per second or 50 millisecond timing. A lot of people want to keep it below that. They want 40 frames per second or 25 milliseconds. Evenly spread things out. I'm going to try to put that. Ooh, okay. Was getting a little feedback. If you cut it down to 40 frames per second or 25 milliseconds, you can't do that on the controller unless you limit yourself to a 680 maximum. There is nothing on the controller itself that will show you that 680. It's just something that you have to keep in mind and be aware of. The good news is it's not a hard limit. A lot of people think if I go to 681, it's going to drop off. I'm down at 40 frames to 20 frames per second. I don't want that. It's a much more gradual thing. You're not coming over here, getting to 680, dropping off a cliff, and you're here. I don't know if it's a completely 100% linear, but it is a gradual taper. So if you get up to 700 and you're still at 38 milliseconds, is that a big deal? Well, it's up to you whether that's a big deal for you or not. Run it, see what it looks like, see if you can deal with that or not. But where it starts to drop off is that 680 limit. If you're getting up to the 1024, then you're going to be closer to the 20 frames per second. You can kind of figure out where you are on that line. For things like mega trees that have faces on them, or some of your singing faces where you're really trying to get them to hit the beat, you probably want to stick closer to this. If you're just running general effects that are a lot of wipes and fades and even butterflies, it's not as critical on those that you'd be way down here. You can come up to closer to the 1024 without any problems whatsoever. But again, it's personal preference. Going to get into some very, very basic network configuration, because I know everybody's shows look exactly like this by the time you're done with all your wiring. It looks like something where, well, we won't admit where this came from. Basically, this is how do you talk to your controller and get everything hooked up. I've talked a lot about the capabilities. Now, how do we hook it up? The best thing to do, in my recommendation, is just hook it up to a router that you have in your house that your computer is connected to. It's the same the router that you're going to be connected to for the internet and everything like that. It can be wired, the computer can be wireless or wired into that router, but the Falcon controller you would plug in directly to the router. A lot of people don't have enough ports on there, so they add a switch. If you don't have a switch or something, find something that you can unplug temporarily and plug it back in. Get it when the kids are out playing or something like that. Disconnect their Xbox, plug in your controller for a little bit, take advantage of that. You can connect it directly to a computer. It's a little more complicated because you have to change some of the computer settings to do that. The problem is if you change the wrong computer setting, you can disconnect yourself from your internet connection. And if you're trying to do that based on what I'm telling you here, you go through, you change that, you were watching it later on a YouTube video, well, now you don't know how to get back online and you're kind of stuck and you don't know what to do. So I'm not going to talk about this any whatsoever. If anybody's trying to walk you through in Zoom on how to do that sometime, just make sure they know what they're doing and they're not going to disconnect you. If you're changing anything for a port and you're connected hardwired to your router, make sure you're changing the right one. Connecting to an FPP, it's the most complicated because you're going to be you're routing between networks there. Don't do this when you first get a controller. Make sure you understand how things work before you do that. And that is probably 75% of what gets talked about in this Zoom room on non-xEssentials days, especially as we get closer to the holidays. If you pop in here, there's a very good chance we're talking about FPP. There are some people whose names have been changed to FPP experts or something like that because that's all they do, helping in here all the time. We could do a future presentation on that if it's needed. It probably is. It's just finding the right person to tell you how to do that. There have been some done in the past too, so you could just look up those on xEssentials. So a direct connection to the router, it's pretty simple. Whatever one your computer is talking to, like I said, you hook up the router hardwired to that into the controller, either one of these ports, any of the controllers I talked about, hook those up. When you power on the controller, it's going to take a few seconds to boot up and it's going to pop up with an IP address here. This is what you're looking for. This is a great functionality of the OLED. It shows you what the address that you need on there. You take that address, you type it into the address bar of your Chrome is what I use. You can use Firefox. I wouldn't recommend using Internet Explorer. It does seem to have some problems with it. There are a few others, but whatever you use to browse the internet, you type that in. It's going to bring up your controller web page. It's got the status configuration, all of that type of stuff. It's as simple as that if you plug it into your router for the first time. If you go one of the other routes, there's things you have to change on your computer. There's things you may have to change on your FPP. There's things you may have to change on your controller. It's just not worth getting into at this point because they're not controller related. They're your other device related. Once you have it plugged in, there is a network configuration page. By default, it's going to be on DHCP. That is basically a dynamic address that could be changing over time for your controller. You don't want that. You don't want your controller to be able to change all the time. You want it to set for something that is static. So what you want to do is you want to uncheck the little button here, and you want to assign it a permanent IP address. This IP address has to be unique for the controller. Every controller is going to get its own IP address. All of your computers, your wireless devices, your wired devices, everything in your house that uses the internet is going to need to have its own IP address. So you want to make sure that it's something different. For this here, I showed that it's on 1.48 and I left it here at 1.48. But if it sets it dynamically with this checked, you usually don't want to use that, because that is something that the router is saying, hey, here's one that I assigned to it. And when I disconnect this and I plug in another thing, I get a new smartphone and I hook up, it might steal 1.48 and I can't use that again. So you want to make sure you're out of the range of your other devices. There's a couple of programs that can help you find that. One is Advanced IP Scanner. You'll hear that talked about a lot. There's the link up here. When you hook that up, it'll scan through your network and you'll see what numbers are in there. Now it put it on 48. 48 was not a good one, because you'll see there's a lot of 42, 43, 51. It's in a bad range. I should have put it up much higher than this 53. 81, I had assigned this one for a laptop, so that's not a problem. But something in the 60s or 70s would have been a good number to use for that. If you don't want to download something like that, you can also do Thing on your smartphone or tablet. It will do the same thing, but it doesn't display as much information. It's missing a lot of these numbers that were dead links before and not reserved, but it will, if you look at this number here, matches the 40.48 number that I had for my F48, that I could type this into and see what it is. But the best bet too is you can just type it into your web browser, see what pops up. But it's just another program that you can use for things. If you need to change it and you don't want to do it via the web page or don't have access, what you can do is use the OLED and the little buttons to go into your network, change this type from DHCP to static using the little buttons, change these numbers here, make sure you save and reboot when you're done changing things, and anything you put in here is going to be updated for your controller. This one here, you'll see I'm on the .41 for my third octet here, which is your subnet. I did this when I was setting it up to use on my FPP at one point. Rather than plugging it in and going through it all, I just change these numbers on the controller, move it around. I do the same thing in the opposite when I'm setting it up. Usually when I'm setting up my controllers and testing them out, I plug them in directly to my router. I get everything, make sure it's working. I rename them and all that. And then when I hook it up, I change these numbers on the face of the controller to do that, because I find that pretty easy to do and it works very quickly. What also is great, if for some reason you have to factory reset your controller, if you know what these are, you can set this all up out in your yard, wherever you may be. If you lose connection, you go out there, you reset these numbers directly on it. You don't have to have the full connection to it. And that is one thing I will say with this. Once you have your controller working, no matter how you have it connected to your computer, to FPP, to your router, take a look at this when you have access, take a screenshot of it, take a photo with it, write it down, do something so that you save these settings so that you know where they are. If you have to do a factory reset on your controller, it will completely eliminate these settings and default back to DHCP, and it will put whatever it wants in here when it connects. A lot of the questions we get are people, it was working last year, I updated the firmware, now I don't know what to do. You don't want to be in that situation, because you can plug back things in together and they're not going to work when you reset these. Take these, make sure you know where your screenshots are, make sure you know where the photo is. What I even recommend to a lot of people is print this out and stick it in the case that your controller is in. Everybody has these really awesome looking cases now and then. You stick a little index card with this printed out in there, maybe laminate it, you have it in there so you know exactly what controller it is and exactly what the settings were, so you can get it back at any time. I can't emphasize this enough, because so many people are like, well, I don't know what this is, I don't know how to get it. I spent 3 hours in here last year getting help on it. We got it set up working perfectly, and now I don't know what to do. And then you get a completely different person helping you, and you come up with something different, and you have to spend a lot more time than you need to. So definitely save these settings. It's to your own benefit. So now I'll go through some of the controller settings on here. Don't have quite this many things, but it seems like that sometimes. When you go to your controller mode, when you first start it up, it's going to show the status. Controller mode, by default, is E131 or ArtNet. For most people, you're going to be keeping it into that. The only other one that is fairly popular is ZCPP that you can put it into. There's other modes in there for standalone, remote, or master that can also be used. I'm not going to cover those in today's presentation because they're a little bit more complicated. But realize that if you change it to one of those modes, even accidentally, it's going to look for that micro SD card to be in there and looking for some files on there. If that SD card is not in the controller, then you need to use buttons to get the controller to do anything, which means you have to have hands-on access to the controller. So if you don't touch this button ever, you won't need the hands-on. But if you're going to be fiddling around with this, make sure you have the controller somewhere you can get to it. If it's out in your yard, buried under a foot of snow, that's no good for you. If it's mounted in your attic somewhere where you have to crawl through it and you're looking for some help, that doesn't help you with here. If you're messing with this, make sure you have hands-on access until you get it set up and know exactly what you're doing with it. Otherwise, keep it in E131 or ZCPP. If you are using ZCPP, it will automatically change into that when you're outputting the ZCPP. At the bottom of that page, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the packet count here. Packets will tell you if information is coming into the controller from either Xlights or FPP, outputting test data, regular data, anything. Packets need to be received for the controller to know what to do. It's basically a way to tell you that something is telling the controller what to do. This is the information, something's going on. If you're not getting packets here, for some reason, the information is not getting to the controller. Check this live update button so you can see this. So when you check on your controller, you know if something's going to it. It's very beneficial. You'll see if you're troubleshooting in Zoom here, a lot of people will ask you, click on this page, we want to see this number. Zoom is a little bit laggy, so sometimes it takes a minute for this to update and we can't see it. But if this number is not going up, we know it's the controller not receiving it. If this number is going up and your lights aren't going on, then we know it's a problem with the controller. Very useful information to be able to know what's happening. And sometimes you'll see that only half of these are going up. Well, if 1 through 8 are going up, but 9 through 16 aren't, well, then we have a configuration problem. And for some reason, something's not putting out these universes. So all good information to know on there. On your E131 ArtNet page, this is your E131 setup where you tell it how many universes you have and what size they are. Now it's very easy to set this up from Xlights, but this can be set up manually. You simply type in the universe number that you would have in Xlights, make sure it matches what you have in Xlights for the number and the size for this controller. Make sure you hit save. Well, make sure it matches. Xlights and FPP, they all have to be the same. If you have 510 in some, 512 in others, you're going to have lights that aren't lighting up the right colors. You want to make sure it's the same and hit save. If you go off of this page and come back here without hitting save, it's all going to default back to what it was. There is no warning when you click off it. There's nothing like that. If you make a mistake, click off the page, come back, nothing will have saved, which is a nice thing. But if you accidentally forget to save, then it's an issue. Your addressing mode up here, universe and start channel is what I have shown. Absolute is also a possibility in here. Use whatever is best that you're most comfortable with. Blanking timeout is the number of seconds that will elapse if you have no data going to it before it will turn off all your pixels. But that also gets set in your output settings. Output settings, it's not really clear how you set up your string ports. You go to output settings, string ports. It will bring up all of the ports that you have available, 16, 32, or 48, depending on your configuration. And most people are using WS2811s, but here's where you pick your different type of strings. There's a bunch available in there. If you click on the little plus sign here that's in the black, it will add a virtual string. If you hit the minus that'll show up after that, it will get rid of the virtual string. The blues are if you're setting up smart receivers, the A's, B, and C's. You hit it once, it'll bring up the A, twice, it'll bring up the B, and then there will be a little blue minus for adding and subtracting that. Description, most of the time, this is just going to be the model that's plugged into the port. You don't have to fill this out. If you upload from Xlights, it'll automatically fill it out. If you don't, you can leave it blank or type it in just to make it easier for you. Most important things on this are the next 3 columns. The start, either universe or channel. You won't have start universe if you're in absolute. You tell it where it's starting, the universe and the start channel, and then the number of pixels connected to that port. By default, it's going to come with everything at 50 pixels. So if you just plug in 100 pixels, when you get this fresh from Dave, plug it in, try to go, plug in 100 pixels, put it in test mode, only 50 are going to light up. It's not a problem with your pixels. It's not a problem with the controller. It's a problem with the configuration. You need to bump that up to 100 to get 100 to light. Group count is if you're trying to have multiple pixels going the same. Group count is not all that popular, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. Your end universe and channel, those are useful because that is telling you where this port is ending. It's starting on universe 1, channel 1, 50 pixels, means it multiplies that by 3 for 3 channels per pixel, ends on universe 1, channel 150. Your next one will start 1 channel above that, and that continues down the line all the way, just moving on, adding 1 to each thing. That might not be how you have it configured in Xlights, but that's what the controller is going to assume. And if you do a clone, it will just keep adding it like that. What's great is if you end up having a model that you can't set up directly in Xlights, you can come in here and set stuff up. Say I have like a matrix that is an odd number of channels and you can't do that. If you type in the pixel counts you want here and I make this 64, it's going to calculate what this end channel is that I can then fill in the next one and go down. Some controllers don't have that feature and you've got to do that all by yourself. It's a little bit cumbersome. Direction basically tells you if pixel 1 is at the connection port to the controller, or if that's going to be the last pixel of this, in this case 50. Some cases, if you tell Xlights that, you don't necessarily need to do this, but sometimes your wiring ends up being a little bit different and you can change it here. It's not that popular, but it can be used. Color order is probably the biggest thing here. String manufacturers all seem to use something a little bit different. Nodes and strips use things a little bit different, and it can change. The biggest thing you have to pay attention to here is you only want to change it in one place. If you change it on the controller, don't change it in Xlights. If you change it in Xlights, don't change it on the controller. One place only. If you start changing it in multiple places, you're going to have a heck of a time trying to get it correct. So only change it in one place. All the options are under here so that you can do it. I recommend doing it at the controller level. It's just easier that way for me to understand. A lot of people don't quite get that. Null pixels, basically this is the number of pixels that are going to come on a string before this pixel will light up. So if you have, let's say, a candy cane model with 99, but you have only a string of 100 in there, you would make the pixel count still 99, but when you're plugging in the string of 100, if it's at the beginning, you would change this to 1. It's going to completely ignore that pixel. It's never going to send any data to it. It pretends like it's not there and lights up the other 99 like you have it configured in Xlights. If you have the extra pixel at the end of the string, just make this 99, and then you can't send any data to that 100th one on that particular string. If you're doing 2 of them, daisy chain, you've got 99, one dead pixel, and then another 99, and then another dead pixel. Make a virtual string by clicking here. You type the first one is 99. The second row you would put in as 99 also, but the second row you would have 1 null pixel. The pixel count does not include the null pixel on any current version of the firmware. There was a version of the firmware where that was erroneous, but that has since been corrected. Zig count is if you're doing zigzags on the controller level only. This almost never gets used if you're using Xlights. Brightness is what gets used most often. Most people will not run their pixels at 100%. They'll knock it down to like 70% for your props that are not very dense. Things like megatrees or matrices, this might go down to like 30%. This adds this is the last one that will do it because the controller is right before it goes out. If you knock Xlights down to 30% and then this down to 30%, you're running your panel at like 9%, or your pixels at like 9%. Again, you may want it that low, but this is going to reduce whatever's coming out of Xlights by this additional percentage. So you need to watch that. Gamma is a color correction, and blank is telling you if that blank out setting for like 5 seconds on the last page is being used or not. It does not blank out this complete row for not being used. It's blank timeout for that. So going through here, I think I explained most of these. I didn't go in a lot of detail on them. There's some more information in the manual on it. A lot of it's pretty straightforward to understand, but if you have questions, I can certainly answer those at the end. I did see one question about the difference between absolute and universe start channel. I thought about talking about that, but I did another presentation back, I think 2 years ago, that talks a little bit more about that. And there have been several others, so I'm not going to get too much into that because you really don't need to know too much about that anymore with some of the advancements. One thing to know when setting up all of this is if when you start putting in numbers, you see red. Red is bad. Red means there's something wrong. If you hover your mouse over it when you're in the program, it will tell you what's wrong. This one here, I've set the pixel count for 150, but on 1 through 16, I've got my slider set for a maximum of 100. You can't do that. I either have to adjust this up to 150 or I have to adjust this down to 100 or less for that to work, to make that red go away. My start universe here is lit up in red because I have this 16 universes. I typed in 415. It's not on the controller. It's telling me that doesn't know what to do. My start channel of 612, your maximum start channel when you're using universe is 512. I typed in 612 because I had fat fingers and it's going to tell me I have an error. Anything that's in red is bad. If you set it up on the controller that way, it's not going to like it. It's not going to work right. If Xlights were to try to upload this, it would fail and your upload would not work. So you basically, red, bad, don't do it. Every now and then, if you're switching between pages, you'll see something light up bad like this, and you know it's not supposed to be bad. Click on the cell, click on a different cell, maybe change the 150, delete the 0, add it back in, click somewhere else, and it'll refresh. Sometimes it's just a refresh issue, but if not, hover over it. It'll give you some explanation as to what the problem is. I want to talk a little bit about the test page on here. The test page seems to confuse a lot of people because it's got all of the ports listed on here. And if you click the enable and have strings plugged in here, if I have strings of 50 everywhere, it's going to light up all of these strings of 50 just fine. The way I have it set up right now, I could individually check these, and one at a time, these ports are going to light up. But a lot of people are not going to leave these 50 everywhere. You're going to reconfigure things, and you're just going to try to test a certain port. Here, port 2, still configured at the 50, going to work just fine. Let's say I change this and I want 150 pixels on ports 1 and 2, but I didn't go through and reconfigure the rest because I'm not going to be using anything there. Or maybe I'm just using 50 and I didn't pay much attention. The problem is when the test from the controller is enabled for just a port, it is not putting out data to that port. It's looking at the port and looking at the start universes and the number of pixels, and basically that calculates the end channel, and it's turning on all of the pixels that are in that range of numbers. So I'm telling it to turn on port 2, but it's turning on everything from universe 1, 151 to 290. Well, if you look down here, ports 3 and ports 4 are both in those ranges of numbers. If I turn on port 2, everything on 2, 3, and 4 may light up. But when I get down to port 2, I'm telling to turn on. Port 3, which is in this range, I'm telling to turn off, essentially, because it's not checked. Same with port 4. So the way I have it now and configured, if I click this, most likely it's only going to still light up 50 pixels, even though there's 150 on there. It's the way that the controller works for its test mode. If you have overlaps, you're going to run into headaches. It's best to go through there and try to delete any of the overlaps that you have so you don't have this problem. It's likewise, if I change from port 2 to port 3 here and click on this, port 2 is telling all of these channels to turn off, port 3 is telling it to turn on. I might get something connected to port 3 if there's only 50 pixels to light up 100%, but the middle 50 on 2 may actually light up simultaneously. A lot of people just have problems with that. So remember, these ports are not lighting up all the pixels connecting to the port. It's lighting up all the channels that are defined on that port when you set it up. So if you have overlaps, that may be part of your problem. Very common to have that. We just had that problem last night or the night before. It happens with a lot of people a lot of times. And again, this is just what I was saying. If I tell port 3 to turn on, part of port 2 is likely going to turn on when that happens. So your controller settings, all of the stuff I just talked about, Xlights makes it very easy to upload. You don't have to go through and manually do all that stuff. There has been some great developments in the last couple of years that make this very, very easy. I will say, I think I have updated all of these slides for the 2018 version of Xlights, or the .18 version of Xlights. Keith just released that a day or two ago, so I tried to get them all, but there may be some that are slightly out of date. So keep that in mind. I try to get it up to date as best I can, but it isn't always the case. And 19 will probably be out before the presentation's finished. So by the time you watch this video again, it'll be out of date. So we had our network configuration page from the controller. We knew what the IP was. The IP came from the little OLED screen. That's the number that we need to put in as the IP on our controller page. I missed the little tab up here that says controller, but when you add it, you want that same IP that you set statically entered into here. Personally, I like making the name here the same up here. A lot of people will just type in some random stuff, or they will type in F48V3. Well, that's great if you have only one, but if you have 2, 3, 4, it can be very confusing. Make it something that you understand, that you know where it's going to go. You don't have to make it super descriptive. That's what the description line is for. This is just a test setup I'm using for training, but I just used F48 test up here, so I quickly and easily know what it is. I personally like making the host name here and this name up here match. It's by no means required. It just helps me make sure that when I'm looking at my controller information, my name up here is the same thing. It's just a method I use to keep it straight. It doesn't have to be. Whatever works for you is good. But like I say, come up with something that's descriptive. I have a test controller, an F48 controller here, an F48. This really doesn't help you figure out what's going where. Tell it it's a yard one. Tell it it's one of your kids' rooms or your office or something like that. Try to make it a little more descriptive than something like that, or you're just going to confuse yourself in the long run. The other thing you want to make sure is you want to set up the vendor and the model when you're setting these up so that your visualizer down here will work later and your upload will work correctly. Anything I'm talking about here is a Falcon. Your model is going to be your F4, F16, whatever. Sometimes there will be an additional drop down under that for a version or variants that says if you have expansion boards or not. Fill that all out, and that will allow you to visualize it and do all your uploads properly. Anytime you're done with all of that, you want to hit the save button. With the 2020 version of Xlights, I would highly recommend, if you're new to this, use the auto layout models and auto size to do everything. I think this actually is an old version, .17 version, because the active is no longer a checkbox because you can't change that on your own. But it still will have active. It'll just be written out there, or it's a drop down or something. But anyway, if you do this, it makes it very easy because you can set everything up by ports. You don't have to worry about universe, start channels, any of that stuff. So I highly recommend that if you're just starting off. If you have stuff set up before, you don't need to change it. You don't need to use that. You'll just need to define your universes down here, how many you have, where it's going. But if you have this from before, you probably know what you're doing and don't need that explanation. Once you have that all in and you hit the saved up here, all of these things are available for your use. You can visualize the controller, which I'll show. You can upload the input and output. You can open the controller webpage just by hitting that button. And the green little dot here means it's online. It's plugged in and it's able to talk to it just fine. So that's nice. If that's not green, for some reason, it's either unplugged or not connected. Going to talk a little bit about the setup here just for doing all this. This is using the current method where you're basically plugging everything in and you see all of your setup here. One of the big things I see with people, especially when they're in Zoom and asking for help, they're coming along and they aren't showing all of these things. There are a total of 4 columns up here. There's little lines in between here where the red arrows are pointing that you can move to adjust these and see more information. And you can grab this edge here and move it over. Normally you'll have your display window here. The display window is very great when you're setting up everything and trying to get your models in the correct position and lay out everything. You need that to make your show run properly. When you're coming into Xlights for help, we really don't care too much about what that looks like, or coming into Zoom for help, we really don't care what that looks like over here. We care about this information. This is what we want to see. So widen these over, make it able so that we can see everything, especially the controller connection, because this we can get a lot of information on, and you can yourself. You can look at, see what type of pixels it is, what port it's connected to, if we got any variants set on here, such as brightness. A lot of information is in this last column that a lot of people don't know exist. Also, if you click up here on any of these, you can sort these either numerically or reverse numerically. Model groups will sort alphabetically. You can do a lot with that. It's very useful that a lot of people just don't take advantage of. So when you're setting up you have a model set up, it's in there. There's a couple of things you need to do. If you're setting up with the way I recommend, you want to put your controller in there. My controller name for this presentation is the F48 xEssential controller. I put that in there. Then I want to tell it what port it's starting on. I have 48 port, an F48. I'm going to start my tree here on the first port on the receiver. It can be anything I want to, but I just chose one for this because you're following through. Then I want to tell it how many strings I have. String is the number of ports that I'm using for the model. How many physical connections to the board it's going to take. I'm using, in this case, 16, just for this example. It can be less than that. It can be more than that. It can be whatever you want, but it's going to take this port number here is going to be the first one here, and then it's going to add this number to it to come up with the last number. One gets used, so this number always is one less. If you take this number, add this number, you subtract one to get that number. And then if you have more than one model on those ports, it's the position of the model on the port. If I was only using one port instead of 16 for this, and it's the beginning, and then I had an arch, I would click this and I would say I want it to chain after the tree. This is the information that you need to be able to come up with where these channels are going to be. It's going to come up with that on its own, and it's going to be able to upload that just fine, so you don't need to do any of that manual configuration in your controller yourself. You still could, if you want to go in there, these numbers into parentheses are the absolute channels. You can go into your controller, and where we were talking about the start channel, if I type in 21 on there, and I know I'm using 16 ports, each of those ports have 100. So my first 16 ports, the first one's going to start at 21. I'll tell it it's 100 pixels. It's going to auto calculate the end channel. I go down through all 16. My last end channel should be 4820. I can type that all in manually if I want to, or I can just upload it. It'll do it for me. Either way will still work. And if you don't use the controller start here, you can still type in the pound and universe number, colon, and start channel number. That's still valid. It's just a slightly different way of doing it that is a little bit more complicated. So for this example, I went to type that in. I went back to my controller thing. I went down to the bottom to the visualize, and this is exactly what I thought I would have. 16 ports, starting on port 1, going down through 16. Each of them has 100 nodes per string, goes down like this, and it looks like this. Well, that's great, but maybe I don't want to use 16 ports just for a mega tree. I can get a lot more than 100 pixels off things. If I turn the brightness down, I probably don't even need to power inject. Maybe I'm not afraid to power inject. I'm not too worried about it. Let's say I cut this in half. I change this down to 8 strings. I add 200 nodes per string and 2 strands. So I'm, instead of just starting at the bottom and going up all the time, starting at the bottom, going up, coming down, moving on to the next one. The channels haven't changed whatsoever. The picture hasn't changed whatsoever. All I did is say, I'm still starting on port 1, but I'm using 8 ports and 200 for each of those. Updates my visualizer accordingly. It's exactly what I thought I would use. Everything here looks good. I could still upload this to my controller, no problem whatsoever. Let's say I want to be really bold and I want to eliminate this, and I just want to do it on one string, a 1600 lights, 16 strands per string. Again, channels haven't changed whatsoever. Still the same number of total pixels for this model. Model still looks the same, but now I've got 1600 pixels that I'm putting on one port. Well, the Xlights is smart enough to let you know you can't do that. 1600 is over the 1024. It's showing it in red there. And what that red is saying is you're not going to be able to upload this. It's not going to work. It's going to fail when you upload. You can't do that. You need to change it to something else. So your visualizer here will tell you what the controller is doing. That's why you pick the variant. That's why you pick the controller type and all that information. It knows what you can and can't do with that. Again, red is bad. It won't upload to the computer. Whenever you see red, you want to do, or to the controller. Whenever you see red, you either need to fix something or hit the button that says save. The other option you can do here too is you don't have to just go, I went back to the 100 pixels per port on 16 ports. Well, I have a F48. Maybe I don't want to use those all coming directly off the controller. A new feature that was just added in 48, if you right click on there, you used to have the option of putting it on just one of these smart string controllers. Now you can do the A, B, and C for daisy chaining universes. And what that, or controllers, what that'll do is it'll start off on port 1A is going to be this top one. Then it's going to go to 2A, 3A, 4A, and you're seeing I'm going through 1, 2, 3, 4. Then it's going to go back and fill out the controller, going back to port 1B, 2B, 3B, 3C, and it goes down through that. Since I'm using 16, once it fills up the 12 on these, because you can only daisy chain 3, it moves on to port 5, it goes through. If I had 2000 pixels, it would start using the Bs on these. If you remember back to earlier when I was talking about setting it up for A, B, and C and which ones are together, and usually you would not set just an A on something, you can use it in traditional mode. This is a case where you would have to set the A on here. You can't use it in traditional mode if you're doing this. But this has been something a lot of people have been asking for on Facebook, and I think a few in the forums that Keith just added to here. Seems to be working well. If you find any bugs, please let him know, because this was just added in .18. When you see the colors on here, it's solid white over here. White means it's acting in traditional mode, no smart receivers. If they're receivers, they're acting in the traditional mode or the dumb mode. When you start seeing colors in here, colors are meaning that they're on smart receivers that are dedicated. The green ones are on A, the purple are on B, the orange are on C. You can pull something off here, not this particular setup, but you can just have purple or red on a particular port for that. It may show a blank up on that line, but the different colors mean you're using smart receivers when you get into that. And again, this is just showing, this is a little bit confusing, but when you're on pixel port 1, this is the port, and this is A, B, and C controller, 1, 5, 9. You'll see that. So the first one is on your 1 port, the second's on the next port, then this. Then we're going down to the next one for ports 2 as you go along there. Little bit complicated to understand. It makes logical sense when you really think about it, but a lot of people are going to start trying to plug this into 1, this into 2, this into 3, and then go, well, what goes into 4? They're going to work their way down. They're going to get confused. Make sure you understand how this works. A, B, C on 1, and then you move down along it. If you have all white on here, it's telling you it's acting in traditional mode, but sometimes it will skip down to a next line. A second line means that you're using a virtual string. I said before, you could hit the little black plus button to add a virtual string, but what is a virtual string? Basically, it's lights that are on the same port, but they have different settings. When I was talking about all those settings that you have on there, brightness, null channels, RGB color order, the direction, or if you have discontinuous channels, that's where you need a virtual string. Why did this put this on a virtual string? Well, I don't really know offhand. The best way to find out, hover your mouse over here when you're in Xlights, it'll bring up a little window and it will tell you the settings on one, and then it'll tell you the settings on the other, compare the two, and you'll see why. Or if you go back to your controller settings, you'll see here, this one I had set for a brightness of 50 on Arches 6. That's a different property than these other 5, so it makes a virtual setting on this when you upload to the controller. These are all going to be at 100%. And they're all going to be together on 1 because they can be. There's no difference in 5 separate ones that are continuously chained. It just adds the 50 for each of these, does 250, all at 100%, gets down to this one. just 50, acting at 50% here, because that's what I set it up for in Xlights. It'll all take care of that just fine for you. Make it easy, but that's where you have your virtual strings. If for some reason Arch 6 I added way at the end and did something goofy where I set its own channel number here, right now you'll see if I add the one to here, it comes down to here, it's one increment. Oh, I'm sorry. This one to this one, it's one above. It doesn't have to be. This could be an earlier number. This could be a much farther number. It can be anything with virtual strings. You have the ability to kind of jump around all over the place. It's not really good practice to do because it can be very confusing, but it's able to be done without a problem. So one thing to notice on here is when you're looking at that third line, and this is, or fourth column, I should say, you can look at these and sometimes see that we've got a problem here. I have a poly line that I added in here, and if you look at previous slides, it was set to port 19, but let's say I took it off of there, or I had everything else in here, and let's say I added my tree at first, then I added this poly line, then I added the arches, and I designated what this was, but I didn't put it on a port, or for some reason I changed that port to 0. This doesn't know where to upload the port to when you do the upload, but also it's still putting this after the tree. When you add a new model, it's going to chain this after the previous model. This number here in parentheses is your channel number, is the same as this one here. I've got overlaps. Overlaps are almost never good. There's sometimes when you do shadow models that you want those, but those are rare cases for most people. And usually you know what you're doing when you're doing that. You're not doing an arch and a poly line like that. What you want to do is you want to make sure you avoid these before you upload everything, or you're going to run into headaches. Over here, you can see I've got a slightly different way. All of these look the same. This one's got the little caret saying it's following the tree. Over here, everything looks like it's set up properly, but I still have a similar overlap over here. Why is that? Because instead of saying use controller over here, I'm still saying it to use the start channel. I told it which controller, but for some reason, I typed in the number here of what I wanted it to do. Maybe I removed it from a port. Maybe I didn't know what I was doing and set it up. But Xlights is not calculating this based on the port number because I have no port number set up. Again, this is one where when you look at it, you're going to see you have overlaps. If you upload it to the controller and do the test like I was talking about, wrong things are going to be lighting up. When you start running your Xlights show and putting things on your poly line, they're going to show up on some of your arch models or your trees or something like that, depending on where your overlap is. There is a little button down at the bottom that says check overlaps, and you go through, and anything that lights up in red will do it. What I prefer to do, go into tools, check sequence. When you go into there, it's going to tell you if you have overlaps as a warning. It's telling you your polyline and your tree are overlapping. Correct these before you upload, because otherwise the garbage in is the garbage coming out of Xlights. It's not a problem with the program, it's a problem with the configuration. Go through, check this out, fix it before you upload, because if you don't fix it before you upload, you're going to be fixing it later and just have to re-upload. What's nice is it's quick and easy to upload, but why do it twice if you can just do it once? If you do use shadow models or something like that, name them something in here so that you know it's an intentional overlap. I'm not going to get too much into shadow models. Keith just covered that not too long ago, but name them so that you understand. You don't want to not understand they're there, especially if you come up for help. Also, before uploading, understand that certain properties and your controller are going to be overwritten. All of your E131 settings are going to be overwritten. Your string port settings for any ports that are configured are going to be overwritten. A lot of people that come in the Zoom room, we're coming in here, we're going to tell them the new way of doing things. Here's how to fix this. Here's how to do this. And then we tell them to upload, and then we find out, oh, they manually configured 95% of it. It was just one string that they were having a problem with. And oops, we forgot, and now we've just deleted all of that. So before you upload anything, back it up if you're in doubt. The little things over here on your status page, save settings and load settings, will save everything that you have to your computer that you are using to access the controller. Make it a file name that you understand. It's everything except your network configuration will be saved. So you can reload that at every time. So put that somewhere safe, know where it is, load it up at any time. Or you can do screenshots and type it all in again. Take your E131 settings, your output settings, take screenshots, and that way you can reconfigure it if your upload goes awry for any reason. Again, a lot of times people are asking for help and they're not really clear on what they're asking, and they've got something half set up and then decided, oh, I'm just going to do it manually. So if somebody tells you to upload and you've been doing things manually, let them know that you're doing that, so we can try to keep things as painless as possible for you. So once you have everything set up and you're happy to upload, all you have to do, I recommend upload the input first, because that's your E131 settings and avoids errors on your string ports if that's wrong. You click that, almost nothing looks like it happens when you click that, and it goes very fast. But if you look down in the corner of Xlights here, it's going to say Falcon input upload complete. It'll happen very quick, probably in under a second. It'll happen, and you'll see that there. When you're done doing that, if you were to go to your web page for your controller, you will see that whatever you had in Xlights will match what you have here. I'll go back here. This said I had 12 universes. This says I have 12 universes. It auto-configured the size at 510. Everything matches perfectly. If you go to this page and you were on this page before and it's got something different, click to a different web page, come back, refresh the page. This will be updated. It does not update live for any of your setup stuff on your controller. After you've done that, you can go to upload output. Output will pop up a second little window that I was having a very difficult time getting a screenshot of, so it's not on here. But that'll pop up, it'll tell you it's uploading things, and then that'll send all your string information to the controller. You can see all this stuff that I had on here before. I've got the tree. Remember, we were saying that this was on, for this one, I set it for 8 ports with the smart receivers. Starts on port 1A, 2A, carries on through this. My first channel here on the tree, 21, is the start channel listed here. I'm doing it in absolute just because it was easier to understand for this. The last channel on the tree I know is going to be on 8A, comes down here. This This number here in parentheses matches the last one on the tree. It's labeled all the ports 1 through 16. I've got 4 differential receivers. This one is A, B, and C on 1 through 4, and then this here. Everything lines up exactly where I thought it was going to be. Arches that I have down here are all similar to what I showed you before, combined onto one line for the ones that are on the same port with no differences. Arch 6 that I did on 50% just to show a virtual string uploaded just fine. Again, same numbers. You can check that for a self-correction. The poly line, I never corrected the overlap here. It uploaded to the controller with that overlap. If I check port 19, it's going to have an overlap with something else, and it's going to light up something else. Again, I didn't do a check sequence. I didn't check through this. That's my own fault. That's not an error with the controller. It's not a problem with Xlights. It's garbage in, garbage out. Sometimes you won't get red in your visualizer and Xlights still won't load. It's going to give you an error that looks like this and tell you that something wrong. The most common cause of that is your channel banks are totaling over 1024, but it might not be in Xlights. It might be on what's on the controller versus what's in Xlights. I just showed it with the arches and the poly line down on 18, 19, something like that towards the end. And I used 16 ports for my tree. Let's say I reconfigured that. I didn't want to use that many. I want to shove everything just onto one differential receiver that's connected to my F48. I changed around all my ports, move things like this. None of these numbers are over 1024. I'm all on one bank. It looks good. There is no reason that this shouldn't upload according to Xlights, according to my little cheat sheet that I made up. Everything looks good. Try to upload it to the controller, it's not going to work. It's going to give me an error. Why? Because I've got 800 pixels on ports 1 and 2 that I'm trying to upload up here. But down here, still on 18, left over from before was 250 pixels. On part virtual strings, you add both together is 300. Add that to the 800, I'm at 1100, which is greater than 1024. Xlights will not overwrite something if I'm not putting anything onto this channel here, or this port here. So if I were to look down, everything from 5 all the way down to 48 is completely blank. I don't have anything assigned to it. Xlights isn't going to overwrite anything from 5 all the way down. It still thinks that these are something you intentionally set up. It's not going to overwrite anything you intentionally set up because you intentionally set it up that way. If I assign something to a port, it's going to update that because that's what it thinks you want to do. But it can't upload this because the total will be over 1024. Xlights will not upload if it's going to cause an error or the red cells, if you were doing it manually, to occur. And like I said, it does not overwrite non-assigned ports. It's doing that because it thinks you have manually assigned something and you don't want to do that. There's no way to get it to overwrite that. So if you come into the room a lot of times asking for help, you'll see a lot of us tell people, go into your controller, delete your description out of your first one, set the start channel to 1 or something very low, set your pixel count to 1, your group count to 1, hit your clone string and clone it to the maximum to get all the way down. This kind of resets all of your pixel counts so that you can upload just fine. However, if you've manually set something up, you can't do that. That you need to pay attention to and look at Xlights, look at your controller, see how you want to do it. But if you want to upload, if you're just doing full uploads all the time and you changed over what your ports are, you might need to come in here, set this low, clone it, and then you can upload and you won't have a problem because it's not keeping that stuff that you had before that you may not want to use now. Another important thing to know is down here, controller connection in Xlights, where you set up your port and all this other information here. Until you upload this to the controller, nothing will actually happen in Xlights. A lot of people will come into Xlights, they will check this brightness box, like I have done here. They'll set it down to 50%. They'll click the output to lights on Xlights and wonder why it doesn't look any different. They'll send it down to 10%. It doesn't do anything. Or they'll come in here and they'll set the color order and they'll be changing around with it. This does not do anything to Xlights itself. The only thing that has a little bit of impact on Xlights is the port number, because that will change your channels. All of the rest of the information will only happen, do something when you upload it to the controller. It's changing those settings on the controller. So keep that in mind when you're doing any of this, any of these checks. If you're changing something here, you need to upload the output to the controller to get that to take effect and want to do something there. The other thing is, if the boxes are not checked, they're not going to change anything. I have nothing here. It's not going to set my brightness to 100% for this unless I check that and set 100%. If I check it over here and set it to 50%, it's going to change that one. If you have chained models, the first one that is checked, it assumes everything after that is going to be the same unless you check it and do something different. For example, on here, if I have my arches, before I had these all at 100%, nothing was showing here because I didn't have anything, so it wasn't going to overwrite. It was going to leave it with the controller default. Here I come in, I change this first arch, I click the checkbox, I change the brightness to 75%, I upload. Arches, which still contains the 250, which is the sum of the first, or total of the first 5, are all now at 75%. Arch 6 is still at 50% because I have another checkbox change on that one for 50%. So unless there's a reason to change something, it's just going to keep going all the way down. That's really important to know if you're chaining things like megatrees or a matrix or something like that, and you don't want something to be very bright. It's very easy to click something at the beginning of a chain and change the brightness. If you have a megatree that's on a bunch of things with a star at the end, you might turn down your megatree down to 30%. But your star just isn't looking as bright because it's a low density star up at the top and you want that brighter. Well, you may have very easily inadvertently put that on the same as something else and you have it changed and you've reduced that to 30%, where maybe you want that at 70 or 80%. So just know how Xlights works for when it's uploading that to the controller. I'm going to talk a little bit about the serial ports now, because this is another source of great confusion with people. And ports, because the captain comes into port, and I had to get a very bad pun in there just because that's me. When we're talking about serial ports, there are 3 jacks on the F16 and the F48. If you're looking at the F4, there's only 1, so you can only do one possible thing. But when you're looking at the F16 or the F48, you'll see that there's 4 possible configurations of pins on these, or ports on these. Why do we have 4 ports but only 3 jacks? Again, that's the way David made the controller. That's the way he set it up. The first one here, DMX1, has all wires for all 4 of these to be able to be configured. So this top one can be set for all 4 of these. The middle one here only has it for number 2. The bottom one only has it for number 3. So that's just how this works. You cannot get numbers 1, 3, and 4 out of the middle. You cannot get 1, 2, and 4 out of the bottom. It's just the way it's set up. The top one will run a differential receiver with all 4 ports. These 2 will not run all 4 ports. They'll only run 1 each or a DMX. These are particularly useful for people that are coming over from DMX or LOR or trying to add that into their displays. Note though that the Falcons do not output LOR protocol. They output DMX onto the LOR board. So you need to have an LOR board that accepts DMX protocol, and that is on the firmware that will run that. If you set it up that just is running LOR, it's not going to work for you. There are jumpers on here for DMX and LOR. If you set that up, this is for the cabling. LOR and DMX use different cabling on there. This is for your cable so that you don't need to buy a special cable. You have to still use the DMX protocol going into the board, but this is showing what cable needs to be used for that. That's where you switch it, and you switch all 3 of the jumpers for whatever board you're using, 2 or 3 if you're using LOR. Never plug LOR into 1. Why don't we plug it into 1? 1 has output wires coming in through all 8 pins that are on that. The DMX, when you're plugging into these, basically there's no ground wire on DMX1. They're all output type things. LOR has a ground wire that is set on here and some negatives, and it'll actually send back voltage to this. Without a ground, it can possibly short out things on the controller or the receiver. That's why we don't plug into 1. Plug in LOR to 2 or 3. This is right from the manual. It tells you what the pins are, what your standard colors are, and what is going to what. If you need to make your own cable for any reason, it shows where it is. But this is why you adjust your jumpers, because DMX has a different configuration than LOR. Again, never connect LOR to DMX1. So there is a little bit of confusion with this, and I even seen that question pop up in chat right there. If you are using a differential receiver plugged into the top port, you can configure all 4 of those ports to work, but then you cannot use the bottom 2 for DMX or LOR or anything else. You can set up these pixels here to come off any port that you want to. If you're setting them up so that it's going to be 1 through 16 on here, it's going to mirror the exact same stuff that's on 1 through 16 on the main board. If you have expansion set up and you still use these 17 through 20, it's going to mirror those. So sometimes if you only have the main board, you may want to tell your controller you actually have an expansion so that you can set these up and be able to use that. The other thing is note that you cannot directly set up and upload this to the controller from Xlights. Xlights will think these are all going to be DMX if you're uploading from Xlights. You need to come in and set these manually for the ports when you're going to do it to be able to do that. I got another slide about that in a minute. If you want to use DMX with a receiver, if you plug in the receiver to number 1 and plug in something to number 2, you can run, I'm showing a DMX type board here that I'm going to put on the second board. I'm sacrificing port 2 out of here. I can still use 3 ports on here, as you can see, set up here. DMX2 is going to put out my serial data to DMX to this particular board here. I'm sacrificing this port in order to be able to do that. If I want to run 2 different ones, 2 chains of these, a lot of these can be daisy chained. What I can do is I can sacrifice 2. I can use 1, and I can use 4 on this, and I can have 2 different universes of DMX coming out of here. Lots of configurations that you can do with it. Whether you want to or not, it doesn't really matter. Theoretically, if you wanted to run all 4 of these off of this, you could make a special cable that comes into here to run additional DMX boards, have 4 different configured universes of running this. I don't see where that is much of a need because you can daisy chain these controllers. You can have 512 channels of output for each one of these. I don't think that many people are running that much DMX, and if they are, they're probably not running it off one Falcon controller. They probably have other things that they're doing. As I said earlier, Xlights will not directly assign this serial ports. You need to come in here and manually tell it that it's going to be pixel data and which ports it's going to be. And then you would configure these ports here just as you would any other port that you're doing. You don't set it up on the DMX serial outputs that you'll see at the bottom. That assumes that it's going to be DMX or something along those lines. Assign it to any other port. All of the rules that we discussed for the 1024 pixel limit still apply to these. It's just coming out a different location than a main board or an expansion board. If you put something on the serial ports, it automatically assumes that it's going to be DMX type data. If I change this protocol to something other than DMX, and there is LOR, PixelNet, some things for other controllers in the dropdown, but if I change this to pixel data, 2811s or something like that, on any one of these ports, you're going to see if it was *3, it's going to disappear off this port and it's going to go back over to your drop down where you put it to something else. You cannot put 2811 onto the serial ports. It does not allow that. You put it onto the other ports, manually configure. But if you're using DMX type data, you just drop it on wherever you want to. LOR or DMX controllers, there's a wide variety of them. They do not get separate IP addresses. If you have any of those type of controllers, you'll realize that you never type in a 192.168 and bring up a web page for them. You play with jumpers on them, dip switches, a firmware update, something like that, to be able to set the start channel. As far as Xlights is concerned, it's part of the Falcon controller. It doesn't see it as something different. The data's coming off the Falcon controller, it's sending it to the Falcon controller translates and sets it out through there. The Falcon controller sends out the first channel that's going to be going out to that. Those controllers, while they are good controllers for a lot of the different types out there, they're not really intelligent. They don't have all the settings and virtual strings like we do in the Falcon controllers. They take one universe, which is 512 channels, and you set the first channel, and the rest of it is the next 511 channels that's going out there. It might not use all 512, but the controller doesn't know that. It gets it, and it either does something or it doesn't do something. Only one start channel, and that's one in the DMX universe. So when we go into the serial output ports, and this may get uploaded directly from Xlights, that makes it easier. But if you weren't doing that, and I were to set up something like this into Xlights, I've got my DMX here, start channel. I put it on universe 403, start channel 1, or my absolute number here. This is the only number that gets put in. These are just two different versions of the same thing on that page. They're not two different settings. The Xlight channel is mathematically configured as the start controller address, which would be one of these numbers, whatever format you want to do, adds the DMX connection number, which is either 1, 2, or 3 in this case, subtract 1, because just that's how the math works out. The formulas are down here, and it will tell you that DMX 1, 2, and 3 are these channels 551, 552, 553. Adds up perfectly. Everything's going to work based on what we do there. This is just a different way of looking at it, where I go down through, and I'm going down all the way through the 512. I started on universe 403.1 or this absolute channel. Either one gives you the same result. Put in my DMX, which take up to 512, and it calculates one of these two. These all line up just perfectly, same as before. But let's say instead of just one port we want to do, we want to add 2. And this controller we're going to have programmed as 1. This controller here, we're going to have number 17. I've set this up in Xlights. I kept just chaining my models through. Everything looks good there. So off of my port 2 here, I'm coming over here and I'm going to say, like I had before, it's starting at 403, start address 1. For this one here, this is now 17. Most people are going to say, well, I put 1 here, I put 1 there, I'm going to put 17 here, so 17 should go here. I see that happen again and again and again, and it makes logical sense to some extent, except when you start looking at the math, you'll find out it really doesn't work that way. And why is that? Because if I change these numbers here to accordingly do the math, just like I did before, you'll see I get different results. My DMX channel 1 is now port 17 or channel 17 or this number. I work down the line. When I get to DMX 17, which is the only thing that DMX controller understands, is it's looking for the 17th channel coming to it. It's actually number 33. This isn't number 33 on here, it's number 4 or 654, which is way up here somewhere. It's not even on the chart. When I get towards 512, if I had a bunch of things connected to it, I'm even onto a different universe. This isn't going to work. It's actually the opposite. You actually want to subtract numbers when you're going that way, or keep this at 1 and make sure that the number over here is greater than this or equal to this number. And I'll kind of show that mathematically on how this works. Here for DMX3, where I said we wanted channel 17, if I were to upload, I'm getting these numbers here. This doesn't look right because let's say my controller I set up for 4031, this is 40298, or this number here is less than this number here. Again, it's subtraction. You're coming in through here, you're subtracting it off to be able to get to this number here, this down here. It's very confusing when you're looking at these very large numbers, but it makes a lot more sense because when you put it at the first universe on something. Let's say you try to upload this and you have these first 3 things changed, 1, 2, 3, and 4, but this last one you're putting on that second controller that's 17. When you try to do the math, it's going to give you errors and it's going to tell you you're getting a negative number. What's happening is in order to get number 17 to come out onto channel 4, it actually has to set this start channel to -12 in order to get that to work. No controller is going to handle a negative number. It's not even going to be able to figure out a universe for that because the universe is going to be less than 1. We have no universe 0 when we're defining things like that. So when you look at that in that respect, it makes a lot more sense that it's not going to work. You don't put in this number in for your start channel for that. You need to configure your serial ports accordingly. The best bet, like I said, is to make sure that the number that you are inputting here, which is simpler to see here when you're in universe start channel mode or just absolute over here, that this number here is always greater or equal to this number here for your DMX channel. And then you can start everything much simpler. The math works out much better. Or even simpler, just let Xlights do it for you. Do the auto layout, auto size. If I put these in here and I chain these together based on the models that they're doing, 1, 2, 3, and I want this one on 17, Xlights made a huge jump between this one and this one here to account for missing channels in there. Even if I put it on a different configuration and let's say I just want one controller that's already pre-programmed for 17, I put it on there. Xlights knows that it's the second controller at 17. I'm not going to have anywhere in my setup channels 1 through 16 because it can't be output and make this work. So you need to pay attention to things like that when you're doing it with the serial outputs. Very confusing. People can't understand it. I probably did a horrible job explaining it. But if you go back and look at this and actually do the math, see how the math works out in those tables, you'll find out it really does make sense and it's not a problem. Don't keep upping that number for the start channel and get closer. Lower that number and you'll start getting things to work better. So I've gone really, really long here and I apologize if I've bored anybody, but I hope I've given you some good information. In closing, the Falcon controllers do have a lot of experienced users. They probably are the most used in this hobby, have the most amount of users on there. If you need help, go to the forums, go to Facebooks, go to the minis and ask somebody. Almost anywhere you go, somebody has used the Falcon controller. If you come in this Zoom room when we're not doing a presentation, you will find tons of people that use them and know them. We will sometimes make fun of the people who use other controllers because we don't like them as well, but we try to keep that to a minimum, but it does happen just because we're most familiar with these. You can also look at the manuals. I'll put that plug in because I worked on them and it's a good reference. And Dave Pitts is an excellent resource too. His number is on his website page. If you run into major problems, call him and ask him. But if you ask for all of the other people that are in here and doing that, we take the burden off Dave so he can vent even more great and awesome stuff that we can use for this hobby. And again, always use tools check sequence before you upload. That will take care of a lot of your headaches. You will find that more often than not, it's a user issue, and you can correct it yourself without needing help. We're always here to help, but a lot of times we'll tell you the same thing. Oh, you need help? Did you do tools check sequence? No? Okay, do that. Let's see if that's your problem. Also, try it before you set it up. And by that, I mean try it before you set it up in the field. Try it in your basement, try it in your workshop, wherever you're doing it. Don't go outside, setting it up, putting it in your attic, putting it under snow, and then say, nothing's working. Sometimes we need a factory reset, and the only way to do that is physically on the board. That makes it very difficult. And most of all, enjoy the controller. It's a good controller. There's not much that you can do to break it. It's relatively easy to fix, at least from a configuration. If you take a sledgehammer to it, yeah, that's going to be tough to fix. But treat it with respect. It's a good controller. It'll get you through a lot of things, and enjoy working with it and have fun with all of this stuff. That's what I've done. That's where I've learned all this stuff. I did not, like I said, I don't know how to do any of the programming for this. I just got the board from David. I really liked it. Talked to him a few times about stuff way back when it was the F16 V2, before it was even the V2R. Got one of those boards. He answered a bunch of questions. I found people in this room that helped, and that's where I volunteered to write the manuals for them, and learned a lot of this stuff as I've been going through. So hopefully that's helpful to everybody. Sorry for going close to 2 hours, but I hope people got a lot out of this, and we can point people to it in the future rather than having to answer the same thing over and over again, point them to different sections of this.
Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation. So you guys can go and unmute yourself and continue with questions.